The sun hung low over the desert town of Red Bluff, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. It was the kind of town where folks kept their heads down, their doors locked, and their prayers whispered. Trouble had settled here like a sickness, and everyone knew the source of it, the McAllister gang. For months, they had run Red Bluff like it was their own kingdom, robbing businesses, beating down anyone who dared stand up to them. The sheriff? Either too scared or too deep in their pocket to do a damn thing. So folks suffered in silence, until today. Because today, a stranger had ridden into town. He came just as the heat of the afternoon started to break. A tall, lean man in a dust-worn poncho, his eyes cold and unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He rode slow, like a man who had nowhere to be and no one to answer to. His name was Clint Eastwood, and he had come for justice. Clint guided his horse down Main Street, his sharp eyes scanning the town. Storefronts were empty. Windows were shuttered. A few folks peeked out from behind curtains watching him pass. He didn't need to ask what was wrong. He could feel it in the air. Fear. Then, from up ahead, laughter, the sound of boots stomping against wood. A table crashing over. A woman's voice, shrill with fear. Clint pulled his horse to a stop outside the saloon. Inside, 5 men sat around a table, playing cards and drinking like they owned the place. Their leader, a thick-necked brute named Jed McAllister, had a cruel grin plastered across his face. He was gripping the wrist of a young woman, the bartender's daughter, his fingers digging into her skin as she struggled to pull away. "You ain't got nowhere to be, sweetheart," Jed drawled. "Why don't you sit right here and keep us company?" The girl's father stood behind the bar, his hands balled into fists, but he didn't move. Didn't dare. That's when Clint stepped inside. The saloon doors swung open, and the room went silent. Jed looked up, frowning. "Who the hell are you?" Clint didn't answer right away. He walked to the bar, slow and deliberate, then tapped his knuckles against the wood. "Whiskey." The bartender hesitated, glancing nervously at Jed, but poured a glass anyway. Clint took a slow sip, then finally turned his attention to the gang. "You got a problem?" Jed sneered. Clint set his glass down. "Looks like you do." Jed's grin faltered. The other men exchanged glances. Clint's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like a knife just waiting to be unsheathed. "Let the girl go," Jed laughed, though there was no humor in it. "You must be new around here, friend." He yanked the girl closer. "Maybe someone ought to teach you how things work in Red Bluff." Clint didn't move. Didn't blink. But when he spoke again, his voice was even lower, even deadlier. "I'll say it once more." The room tensed. Jed's grip on the girl tightened, and Clint's fingers twitched toward his holster. What happened next would change everything. The silence in the saloon was thick, the kind that pressed against your chest and made it hard to breathe. Every eye was locked on Clint and Jed, the air between them stretched tight like a drawn bowstring. Jed's fingers curled tighter around the girl's wrist. His grin returned, but this time it was forced. "I don't take orders from nobody," he spat. Clint's eyes didn't move from his. "Then that's your first mistake." Before anyone could react, Clint moved. His hand swept down, fast as lightning, and in one smooth motion, he drew his revolver and fired. Bang! The bullet didn't hit Jed, but it didn't have to. It shattered the whiskey bottle on the table, spraying glass and liquor everywhere. The shot was so close to Jed's hand that he yelped and let go of the girl out of pure instinct. She stumbled backward, rushing to her father's side, her breath ragged. The room froze. Jed stared at Clint, his face a mix of shock and rage. His hand hovered over his own holster, but now he was second-guessing himself. Clint didn't flinch. His gun was still raised, barrel steady. His expression was cold, almost bored. "Next one, don't miss." One of Jed's men, Clyde, a wiry guy with a nervous twitch, grabbed for his own gun. Clint barely moved. Bang! Clyde's gun flew from his hand, a fresh bullet hole smoking in the wooden floor beside him. He howled, clutching his wrist. The rest of the gang hesitated. Jed's nostrils flared. His fingers twitched at his side. But he didn't draw. Not yet. Instead, he bared his teeth. "You don't know who you're messin' with." Clint cocked his head slightly. "I know exactly who you are." He took a step closer, his voice even lower now, a warning carved into every word. "You're a coward who hides behind a badge that ain't his. You steal from good people. You hurt folks who can't fight back." Jed's jaw tightened. "And the worst part?" Clint continued, taking another slow step forward. "You ain't even good at it." A muscle jumped in Jed's cheek. He was close to snapping, and Clint was waiting for it. Jed's breath came in short, angry bursts. His fingers twitched again, hovering just above his holster. Around him, his men shifted uneasily, hands hovering over their weapons but not daring to move first. Clint stood still, revolver steady. His eyes never left Jed's. He wasn't in a hurry. The whole saloon held its breath. Then, like a rattlesnake striking, Jed drew. But Clint was faster. Bang! Jed's gun barely cleared the holster before Clint's bullet tore into his shoulder. The outlaw roared in pain, stumbling back as his revolver clattered to the floor. Chaos exploded. One of Jed's men lunged for his rifle. Bang! Clint's second shot dropped him before he could fire. Another outlaw dove behind a table trying to get a shot off. Bang! Clint's third bullet shattered the leg of the table, sending the man crashing to the ground. It was over in seconds. Jed was on his knees, his hand gripping his bleeding shoulder, his face twisted in pain and disbelief. The rest of his men were either on the floor groaning or too scared to move. Clint stepped forward, his boots slow and deliberate against the wooden floor. He crouched in front of Jed, close enough for only him to hear. "You're done." Jed gritted his teeth, sweat dripping down his face. "You got no idea what you just started," he spat. "My brother." Clint pressed the barrel of his revolver against Jed's forehead, silencing him instantly. "I don't care." The words were calm. Final. The message was clear. Jed McAllister wasn't the only one who could make threats. Jed's chest rose and fell quickly, his mind racing, but he knew. If he made one wrong move, he wouldn't leave this saloon alive. And so, for the first time in his miserable life, Jed backed down. Clint stood up and holstered his revolver. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the saloon. Behind him, the town of Red Bluff was waking up. The moment Clint stepped out of the saloon, he could feel the shift in the air. People were watching. Shopkeepers peeked out from their doors. Families huddled by their windows. Even the blacksmith, a burly man with soot-streaked arms, had stopped. His hammer mid-swing. They had heard the shots. They had heard the fight. And now they were watching to see what came next. For the first time in months, the town of Red Bluff wasn't cowering in fear. Clint didn't say a word. He simply walked toward his horse, his steps slow, unhurried. He had done what needed to be done. Then, a voice broke the silence. "Mr. Eastwood." Clint stopped, turned. It was the bartender, the same man who had been too afraid to stand up. To Jed, minutes ago. But now, something was different. His hands weren't shaking anymore. "You..." The bartender swallowed, then tried again. "You just did what none of us had the courage to do." A murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd gathering outside the saloon. Clint didn't respond. He just let the moment settle. Then an older man stepped forward. The town's doctor. His hands were rough with age, but his eyes were sharp. "We should lock them up," he said, nodding toward the saloon. "Those men have done nothing but terrorize us. It's time we take our town back." A few of the men in the crowd exchanged nervous glances. The sheriff was nowhere to be found, probably hiding, like always. But then, someone else spoke. "I'll help," said the blacksmith, wiping his hands on his apron. "Damn coward's been running us for too long." Another man stepped forward. Then another. Clint watched as the people of Red Bluff, folks who had spent months living in fear, finally stood tall. He gave a small nod. About time. Then, without another word, he turned back to his horse. Behind him, the town was waking up, and the real fight was just beginning. As Clint tightened the saddle on his horse, the sound of heavy boots on wooden planks caught his ear. He turned slightly, just enough to see a man stumbling out of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Grady, a thin man with a badge too big for his chest and a bottle of whiskey clutched in his trembling hand. His eyes were bleary, his face pale as he looked around at the gathering townsfolk. "What the hell's going on?" he slurred, trying to stand tall. His eyes flicked toward Clint, then toward the saloon. He swallowed hard. "Where's Jed?" The blacksmith stepped forward. "Bleeding on the floor, right where he belongs." The sheriff paled. His gaze darted between the crowd, searching for support, but found none. You can't just go round shooting people," he stammered, pointing a shaky finger at Clint. "Jed and his boys, they run this town." Clint barely gave him a glance. "Not anymore." The sheriff let out a nervous laugh, but no one joined him. The bartender crossed his arms. "You ain't done a damn thing to stop them," another man spoke up. "All you ever do is drink and look the other way." The sheriff took a step back. You don't understand," he mumbled. "If we go against them, their people will come. They'll burn this whole town to the ground." The crowd wavered. Fear had been their prison for too long, and even now it tried to pull them back. But Clint turned to face them, his voice steady. "Then you stand and fight." The townsfolk looked at him, uncertain. Clint let the silence hang, then spoke again. "They've taken your money, your peace, your dignity. You gonna let 'em take what's left?" The blacksmith stepped forward again. "No," he said firmly. "We ain't." The bartender nodded. "Not anymore." One by one, others agreed. The sheriff looked around, sweat dripping from his brow. You're all making a mistake," he stammered. "We can't win this fight." Clint stepped closer. "Then leave." The sheriff blinked, confused. "You ain't no lawman," Clint said. "You're just another coward." Tom Grady's lips pressed together. He looked at the faces around him, faces that no longer feared him or the men he had let run free. Then, with a muttered curse, he turned and stumbled back into his office, slamming the door shut. Clint didn't watch him go. Instead, he looked at the people of Red Bluff. Their fear was still there, but something else had taken root, something stronger. Determination. And for the first time in a long while, Clint knew. This town had a chance. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the town in hues of orange and gold. But for the people of Red Bluff, the night ahead promised no rest. Inside the saloon, Jed McAllister and his remaining men were bound up, their faces twisted in pain and anger. The townsfolk, led by the blacksmith and the bartender, had taken up arms. Old rifles, rusted pistols, even wooden clubs. Some had never held a weapon before, but that didn't matter. They were done being afraid. Clint stood at the fire, center of it all, watching as men and women boarded up windows, reinforced doors, and set up positions along rooftops and alleyways. The bartender's daughter, the one Jed had tried to take, approached him. "They're coming, aren't they?" Clint looked at her, then gave a small nod. "Yeah." She swallowed hard. "What? If we lose?" Clint studied her for a moment. "Then you fight till you can't no more." She nodded, determination flickering behind her fear. Just then, a rider came galloping into town, his horse kicking up dust. "They're comin'!" he shouted. "Jed's brother and the rest of 'em, about 20 men, maybe more." A hush fell over the town. The blacksmith stepped up beside Clint. "We ain't got 20, he muttered. Clint didn't answer. He just looked at the people standing before him. Merchants, farmers, husbands, wives. They weren't trained fighters. But they had something stronger than bullets. They had a reason to stand. He turned to the crowd. "Get to your positions," and then they waited. The storm was coming. The night air was thick with tension. Every creak of a wooden floorboard, every gust of wind rattling a loose shutter, sent shivers down the spines of the waiting townsfolk. Then, in the distance, hoofbeats, slow at first, a steady, menacing rhythm, then louder, faster, Clint stood in the middle of the street, his hat low over his eyes, hands resting at his sides. He could feel them coming before he even saw the dust rising against the moonlit sky. And then, they arrived. Jed McAllister's brother, Virgil, led the gang. A towering man with a thick, scruffy beard and cold, merciless eyes. His gang rode behind him, 20 men armed to the teeth, rifles slung across their backs, pistols gleaming under the dim lantern lights of Red Bluff. Virgil pulled his horse to a stop, scanning the town. His eyes landed on the saloon, where his brother and the rest of his men were held captive. Then he saw Clint. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "You the one who shot my brother?" Clint didn't move. "Yeah," Virgil chuckled. "Boy, you must have a death wish." He turned his gaze to the townsfolk hiding behind barrels, windows, and doorways. "And all you good folks, do you really think this hired gun's gonna save you?" The blacksmith stepped forward, rifle in hand. "We ain't hiding anymore, Virgil." Virgil's grin faded. His eyes narrowed. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he growled. His hand twitched toward his gun. Bang! A single gunshot split the air. One of Virgil's men tumbled from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. Virgil's eyes snapped back to Clint, who was still standing in the street, smoke curling from the barrel of his revolver. "I ain't asking twice," Clint said, his voice calm as ever. "Turn around. Leave." The gang hesitated. Virgil's jaw clenched. Then, with a growl, he yanked out his gun, and all hell broke loose. The moment Virgil pulled his gun, the town erupted in gunfire. Bang, bang, bang! Clint ducked, rolling behind a water trough as bullets tore through the air. The townsfolk fired. From windows and rooftops, their shots wild, but full of desperate courage. Virgil's men charged forward, some firing from horseback, others leaping off to take cover behind wagons and barrels. A few of them made it into buildings, smashing through windows as they tried to flush the townsfolk out. Clint popped up, his revolver steady. Bang! One of the bandits spun and dropped. Another took aim at the blacksmith. Bang! Clint's bullet found him first. But there were too many. Virgil's men were ruthless, trained killers. They moved fast, overwhelming the untrained townsfolk. A scream rang out as one man was shot, collapsing against a wooden post. A woman sobbed as she held her rifle, her hands shaking too much to fire. And then, a group of bandits rushed the saloon, trying to free Jed and the others. Clint saw it too late. "Stop 'em!" the bartender shouted, but they were already at the doors, cutting through the weak defenses. Virgil laughed, reloading his gun as he watched his men force their way inside. "You should have run, Eastwood," he called out. Clint's jaw clenched. He knew if Jed got free, it was over. Without hesitation, he ran toward the saloon. Ducking under gunfire, leaping over a fallen wagon, he reloaded as he ran, his eyes locked. On the doors where the bandits were breaking through, he had to stop them, because if he didn't, the town of Red Bluff was lost. Clint burst through the saloon doors, just as one of Virgil's men was cutting the ropes off Jed's wrists. The outlaw's eyes lit up with triumph, until he saw Clint's revolver aimed right at him. Bang! The bandit crumpled. Jed, still half-bound, lunged for a pistol on the floor. Bang! Clint shot again, this time hitting the gun, sending it skidding across the floor. Jed froze, his face twisted in rage. "Damn you, Eastwood!" he spat. Clint kept his gun trained on him. "Stay down!" Outside, the gunfight raged on. The townsfolk fought hard, but Virgil's men were relentless. One by one, the defenders were being pushed back. The bartender had taken a bullet to the leg, and the blacksmith was using his last rounds. Clint knew they were running out of time. And then, he heard it. The sound of hoofbeats. Not Virgil's men. Someone else. And they were coming fast. Virgil heard it too. His eyes darted toward the dark horizon. "What the hell?" Suddenly, out of the shadows, riders appeared. A dozen of them, armed, fast, and deadly. They rode into town like ghosts, firing into the gang with terrifying precision. The tide turned in an instant. Virgil's men, caught off guard, were picked off one by one, and leading the charge was the sheriff, Tom Grady. The cowardly lawman, who had disappeared earlier, now rode in at full speed. a rifle in his hands, firing like a man possessed. Virgil's face twisted in shock. No, no, this ain't… Bang! A bullet struck his leg, knocking him to the ground. The sheriff leaped, off his horse, standing over him. This town's done being scared of you, he growled. Inside the saloon, Clint stepped over Jed, pushing open the broken door. He took in the sight of Virgil lying wounded, his gang either dead or captured. It was over. Red Bluff had won. Morning. Light broke over the battered town. The people of Red Bluff had suffered, but they had survived. They had fought for their home, and they had won. Virgil and the remaining outlaws were locked up, awaiting justice. Jed, still nursing his wounds, was thrown onto a wagon, ready to be taken out of town for good. Clint stood at the edge of town, his horse saddled, his job done. The bartender's daughter walked up to him. You could stay, you know, she said softly. Clint looked out at the horizon. He had seen too many towns, too many fights, too many faces lost to time. He gave her a small smile. Ain't my place. The blacksmith stepped forward, shaking Clint's hand. We owe you everything. Clint tipped his hat. Just stand your ground. Ain't nobody gonna push you around again. With that, he mounted his horse. The town watched as he rode off into the sunrise, his silhouette fading into the golden light. Red Bluff was safe, and Clint Eastwood, he was already on to his next fight.